Welcome to PwC's What's Next in Cyber podcast series. I'm Joe Nocera, PwC's leader of the Cyber and Privacy Innovation Institute, and I'll be your moderator for today's episode. We'll be gathering some real-time feedback from our guests on new approaches to cyber operations. Joining me remotely from their homes are our managing directors, Chris O'Connor and Christina Galligan. Welcome, Chris and Christina. So let's start with you, Chris. What are some of the challenges that you've seen in the current threat landscape?
Thanks, Joe. I think there's two big areas to sort of look at those under. One is velocity, and the other is the democratization of sophistication. And what do I mean by that? It means that it used to be that nation states and some very advanced adversaries would have the capability to execute complex technical assaults on enterprises. Over time, that capability, that sophistication, has trickled down into the broader threatscape. Additionally, the threatscape itself, the ecosystem, the maturity of that ecosystem has really progressed over the last decade or so. And you've seen a modularization and a commoditization of capability. So now bad actors are able to really grab small pieces of capability and execute those against enterprises. And those capabilities are very advanced. And the combination of that trickle down of the nation state and that maturation of the ecosystem has really accelerated the volume of attacks, the sophistication of attacks, and the speed by which those attacks are able to be coupled together and put against an enterprise. When you also take into account the fact that the enterprises themselves are having, sort of difficulty putting together their defenses, it's a pretty bad situation for many of the companies that are out there. If you look at an example of ransomware, when it first came about, was relatively rudimentary, was relatively easy to figure out who the attackers were, where their command and control was, what tools they were going to use. Now there are extremely sophisticated ransomware actors, and they're not only doing, their threats are not only just about, hey, we're going to hold you hostage and not let you have access to your data. They're now saying, hey, we're going to release your data. It's a 1-2 punch. We're going to hold you hostage, and maybe we're going to release it. And we're going to demand more payment from you, and we're going to make it much more difficult for you to eradicate us from your environment. Their persistence, their ability to move laterally, greatly advanced. If you kind of pull on that thread a little bit, you say, well, where's the supply chain attacks going to progress to now? Now that you've seen nation states sort of show capability in the supply chain, to the heart of the supply chain, software updates, and what they're capable to do, we can only expect that that's going to trickle down over time as well. So I really think that the key areas are velocity and then the democratization of sophistication for the threat actors.
So that's a new one for me, Chris. I've heard of trickle-down economics. I guess now it's the trickle-down cyber threat landscape. So Christina, let's go over to you. What are you seeing that's really driving this expansion and complexity in attack surface area, maybe specific to cloud services, if you don't mind?
Thanks, Joe. So in order to really understand an enterprise threat profile, you have to know first what are your assets. Then you need to understand your vulnerabilities, so your issues related to those assets. And then it's critical that you understand who's accountable for those assets. So with regards to cloud services, you add additional complexity to that traditional triad that you've identified. So one is really quantifying your assets. So in the cloud, you have assets that can be provisioned in a matter of seconds and can be torn down in another matter of seconds, to support containerized workflows and also just, dynamic and rapid provisioning. And so how do you handle that when you're looking at a traditional IT asset workflow? So I think a lot of organizations are struggling with determining how do they inventory those assets. And then secondly, how do you assess and monitor the vulnerabilities? So knowing and understanding what might be vulnerable on those assets, especially if they only live for a fraction of a time, right? So what's most important is that enterprises are able to identify assets from a visibility perspective, and then also make sure that they have the right tools in place to be able to monitor and triage those assets and really be able to understand where are the security concerns and then where do they need to spend the bulk of their time. So a lot of the traditional security monitoring tools were focused on traditional IT, so your server-based infrastructure. With the advent of cloud, there's a lot of additional tools that are necessary, but there's also telemetry and there's additional controls that need to be applied from a governance perspective. So if you look at a cloud-based infrastructure, there's additional attack surface concerns with regards to permissions, multi-factor authentication, and most importantly, that your assets are typically directly on the internet. You do have a logical boundary that can be applied, but from a traditional IT perspective, the traditional way to look at it was that the assets were behind a firewall or on some sort of defined broadband network where the enterprise could control it. With cloud, you're basically dynamically provisioning on somebody else's infrastructure. So it's critically important that you're able to get visibility as soon as those assets are provisioned and spun up. I think the third area is just determining accountability. So the challenge with a lot of cloud infrastructure is that you can get some shadow IT in place in some organizations. So you're unclear necessarily like who owns those assets, and you're also unclear who's responsible for maintaining and also making sure that the security is in place for those assets. So when you do have an incident or you do run into some sort of breach situation, it's important to know who owns those assets so you can go pull logs and be able to really respond.
Okay. I appreciate that, Christina. Maybe back to Chris, thinking through some of the challenges that you've been hearing from your clients. What are some of the key challenges that you're seeing around cyber operations?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. To what Christina said, some of it is just being able to keep pace with the business. So businesses are moving to the cloud, as she said, and are really looking for ways to enable themselves to do business faster. And as I mentioned before, the adversaries are moving at a much faster pace. So just being able to operate your cyber operations capability at pace with your business and at pace with the adversary, it's difficult. And I look at it kind of in a lens of three areas. One is technology complexity. We in the past as cyber operators looked at defense in depth. But now that we have so many tripwires, many of them not communicating with each other, the ability to find meaningful metrics, to operate in a concerted way, so really defense in concert versus defense in depth, it's difficult. And it takes really some forethought, some good engineering, good integration, actionable intelligence that's automatically fed into tool sets and into controls. So there's struggles with most cyber operators to get the most out of their technology, to reduce the complexity of that technology, and to really get it to afford them the protections we need. Right in line with that, you have the areas around process documentation, and then process automation. Most cyber operators are understaffed. Most people wear multiple hats, and most of the time you're trying to whack the mold in front of you. Because of that, we rarely take the time to fully document the operating procedures that we're executing on a daily basis. Without that documentation, it's really difficult for clients to then automate, because if you don't know what you're doing manually and know how you're doing that consistently, it's difficult to turn that into an automated process. And then finally, staffing. I mean, staffing is probably the biggest thing that our clients struggle with. It's having the right level of expertise, the right level of capacity, training to retain that talent once you have them. I mean, the market's still hot, and once you have folks sort of trained up, the turnover's often high at most enterprises, and it's difficult to keep the staffing level you need to execute the cyber operations and keep up, as I said, with the adversary and with the business. So I think those are the main areas that folks are struggling with.
Okay. So Christina, as we think about how organizations can better prepare their cyber operations to be ready for the threat landscape, one of the things I hear a lot about is better integration with the business, with the rest of IT, with the rest of fraud. What are you seeing in that space that organizations should be thinking about?
Sure. So, following on with what Chris said with regards to staffing, I think that's a challenge that's not going to go away, right? The cyber resource pool will continue to, be constrained, and organizations will continue to struggle to hire just because there's just the cyber threat is just ever evolving and increasing. And so I think what organizations need to do is figure out what's the best use for the staff that they have. And so I think paramount around that is partnering with the business. So I would say, traditionally most cyber operations teams have been largely transactional with the rest of the business. They'll reach out when an alert comes in, they'll ask a few questions about user activity, but there's not necessarily been the focus on embedding with the business and really understanding the business process. And so what would be probably, the first step I would look at if the business is really just transactional with the rest of the organization is really looking at partnering with other areas of the business like IT or fraud and identifying what their roadmap items are. So often as a cyber operations unit, you're trying to monitor, you're trying to enforce standards, you're trying to, provide advice, and you may be serving in a security architecture consulting type of function. And so what often happens is there's security priorities that need to get done, but the business also has their own priorities and roadmap, and those aren't necessarily aligned. And so what happens is the security team goes out and says, hey, you need to do X, Y, Z. And the business says, that's great, but I've also got these other priorities. And so the more the security teams can embed with the business and really partner on the roadmap if possible, that will really empower them to be able to respond and then also really make it a two-way conversation. So the goal is with security is that you make it more of a two-way conversation with the rest of the business. So when you do need something, you know exactly who to call and they're more likely to work with you. I think when we look at how we can better overlay data, so if we go to sort of more of a fusion concept, we can look at, the fraud and IT data. There's a lot of discussion around fusion in those areas. And I think when you look at data fusion, I think the first thing you should do is you always want to look at what are your objectives for pulling that data together. So often we see organizations will just pull a bunch of data together, put it into a large aggregator, and then kind of hope that there will be insights and outcomes that occur. And I think you've got to go at it from a use case definement perspective. So you've got to look at what data do I need to collect in order to answer the questions that I'm looking at. But there is a lot of power in that data. So if I take the example of IT data, for example, if you see a server that has high level of CPU, that's not necessarily something that's going to come up on the radar of the security team, but it could absolutely be an indicator of compromise, like Chris mentioned earlier with regards to ransomware. And so what you're looking for when you try to combine the IT or the fraud data or even the threat intelligence data is how do I back up the cyber, basically kill chain, if you will, and be able to be more into that early warning indicator sign. Reconnaissance identification is incredibly difficult, but the better able the organizations are to identify in that life cycle of potential activity and potential compromise, the more they'll be enabled to future-proof the organization.
All right. Well, thanks, Christina. You actually just started to get into the question I was going to ask next. So maybe I'll start with Chris, and then Christina, you can jump in. Christina was starting to talk about future-proofing their cyber operation teams, and maybe thinking about the tech stack. Chris, how would you advise organizations to be thinking about future-proofing their cyber teams?
That's a great question, Joe. I think I would look at it in two areas. The first one would be to expand your aperture. And what do I mean by that? Oftentimes we can settle into a community that reinforces ways that things have been done before and the options and sort of thinking outside of that box, for lack of a better way to say it, become less and less. We get into a bit of a groupthink. So having the right partners, associations, networking, really understanding what's emerging out there. What are ways to do things that are different than the way you currently do things? Not just trying to make how you do things marginally better or marginally more efficient. Is a really radical change that you could apply towards how you're operating your cyber operations that might bring market difference and market capabilities. I think that's very important. And if you sort of think about what you're doing right now, likely is not going to be sufficient to protect you against next year or the year after that's threats. It's absolutely not going to be able to protect you against threats 5 years from now. So really having some lens into the future about where you want to be and some capability to get new thought into your process to understand what are the options that are out there. I think that's really key. Another thing I'd recommend is thinking about the future along two axes. One is the threat. So who are the bad guys? What are they doing? How are they doing it? Who are they targeting and why? And keep that fresh. Really understand who are you defending yourself against? And with that in mind, the other axis I would use is your business. So everything you have is not as valuable as everything else you have. And there are impacts that could happen to your business uniquely that you should be aware of, and you should be really affording most of your protection to those things that matter most, and you should be defending yourself most against those threats that are likely to be aimed at you and potentially be successful. So threat modeling and, as Christina had said, cooperation with the business really are key to future proofing. Thanks.
Christina, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I agree with what Chris said, and I would add to it, I think organizations really need to look at how they can be resilient in the face of cyber threats and really cyber response. So in this particular situation that we're in right now, there's a number of different threats, and I think what's most important is organizations need to figure out when they do need to respond to an incident, whether it be large or small. How are they going to do that, and what questions are they going to ask, and make that really an iterative improvement loop. So for every incident or every investigation that goes on, there should be almost like an after action type of activity that occurs to identify what data did we not have that we needed, what questions could we not answer that would have been really helpful? And I think most importantly, what would have helped us recover faster? So every time an organization is affected by a cyber situation, there is a loss, whether it's from just personnel time or all the way up to if there's a particular data loss. And so what you want to be able to do is be able to be resilient in the sense that your response and your investigation becomes normal course of operations and is less disruptive to the business. So whatever you can do to reduce that time and be able to respond quickly and be able to provide the information back to the business, because the number one thing that your executives are going to want to know is, was there an impact? What was the impact? And do we need to be talking to our customers? From a reputational integrity, most organizations are going to get questions from their customers first and need to be prepared to respond. And if you're scrambling to identify the data points, or you're scrambling to be able to figure out what your response plan is in the moment, that's a very difficult thing to overcome. And so the most important thing I think organizations can do to identify resiliency is to start off with those tabletop exercises. So a lot of organizations, they'll put together a scenario and they'll do a tabletop exercise and really make sure, like we were talking about business partnership earlier, make sure you're including your partners in the business, because often you're in the middle of the night, you're trying to pull logs or something like that off of a particular server, and you're going to need your partners in the business to be able to enable that. So I would say, first thing to be resilient is run your tabletop exercises. And then if you have the capacity to do it in the leadership support, I would say try to run an actual simulated activity. It's interesting when you compare a tabletop activity to an actual activity with real data, how you tend to identify those areas where you need either some improvement or there's some opportunity for enhancement. And that can also serve as information that can be taken to leadership from a budgetary perspective to justify additional spend or additional investment in particular areas.
Okay. Well, last question for me then. Any final takeaways that we'd like to lead the audience with, Chris, and then Christina?
Sure. I think one thing that enterprises should really be considering is some way that they can regularly assess where they are. So what is their maturity level? And really to understand where do they want to go? And how do I intend to get from where I'm standing to where I want to be? And to keep that fresh. So some level of maturity assessment of what does my organization look like? Is it what I need? And how do I get it to be better? And then kind of always refining what is that desired end state, where I want to end up. And that could be fulfilled by lots of different ways. Classic maturity assessments, controls assessments, even red team, purple team type activities all feed into that knowledge base of really what do I have and how well is it executing. And then really there's more strategic vision into where do I want to be. And as I mentioned before, have a wide aperture into what the possibilities are into where you want to end up. And then how do I navigate from where I'm standing, an informed understanding of where I'm standing, to where do I want to be. I think that's very important for an enterprise.
All right. Christina, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I would say, I would advise organizations to not get discouraged by all of the news that we're hearing around cyber, right? There's always something that you can do to improve your organization. And there's always new challenges out there, right? So I think, as Chris mentioned earlier, we always want to look at quantifying and identifying your threats, and then really identifying which investments are best able to address those threats, and then just continuously improving in collection of data and information.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to thank both Chris and Christina for taking the time to talk with us today. I think this has been an outstanding discussion. And for those of you listening, we'll be back soon with another episode of What's Next in Cyber.
Copyright 2021 PwC. All rights reserved. PwC refers to the PwC network and/or one or more of its member firms, each of which is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This content is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.